My name is Sarah Lawson, and until 6 months ago, I was a respected scientist, a geneticist with a promising future. Today, I no longer know who or what I am. I'm recording this account as a testimony, a warning perhaps for whoever may find it, because the truth I discovered about my family, about myself, is something no one should carry alone. It all began on my 35th birthday. It was an ordinary Tuesday. The laboratory was quiet except for the constant hum of equipment. I was bent over the microscope, analyzing DNA sequences as I did every day, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, too quick to be real, too dark to be natural. I blinked, and it was gone. I attributed it to fatigue. After all, I had spent the previous night reviewing data for an important research on genetic markers associated with neurodegenerative diseases. But it wasn't an isolated incident. In the days that followed, the shadows became more frequent, more daring. They danced at the edges of my vision, always dodging when I tried to focus on them. At first, I tried to ignore them, convincing myself it was just stress. After all, our laboratory was about to publish a groundbreaking study on a new gene therapy for Alzheimer's. Pressure was immense, and then came the whispers. At first, they were just indistinct murmurs, like a muffled conversation from another room. But gradually, they became clearer. Familiar voices, though I couldn't identify them. They called my name, begged for help, screamed in agony. The first time I heard my name clearly, I was alone in the laboratory late at night. The whisper came from behind me, so close I could feel the cold breath on my neck. "Sarah, help us." I spun around abruptly, knocking over test tubes in the process. But there was no one there. I refused to believe I was losing control. After all, I was a scientist. My mind was my most precious tool. I sought rational explanations: stress, sleep deprivation, even a brain tumor. I took tests, consulted neurologists, psychiatrists, but all results came back normal. "You're in perfect health, Dr. Lawson," they said, while I struggled not to scream that I could see shadows moving behind them. That's when I decided to investigate my family history. I grew up without knowing my father, raised by my Aunt Elena after my mother's premature death. Elena had always been evasive about the past, but now I needed answers. I called her on a Friday night, after another exhausting day at the laboratory, trying to ignore the voices that now followed me even at home. "Sarah, dear," Elena said, her voice trembling on the phone. "There are things about our family that are better left buried." But I insisted, and what I discovered chilled me to the bone. Generation after generation, my family lineage was marked by tragedies, suicides, confinements in asylums, unexplained deaths, and the pattern was always the same. It started around the age of 35, with reports of terrible visions and tormenting voices. I found old diaries, newspaper clippings, medical records that my aunt had kept in a box in the attic. Each document I read seemed to open a new door to a family nightmare I never knew existed. My own mother. I always believed she had died in a car accident, but the truth was much darker. She threw herself off a bridge, screaming about demons chasing her. I was only 5 years old at the time. The police found her diary, full of disturbing drawings of shadowy creatures and frantic notes about voices that tormented her. The police report described how witnesses saw her talking to the air moments before jumping, as if she was surrounded by invisible people. With each new discovery, the manifestations intensified. The shadows took form, distorted faces of people I never knew, but somehow knew to be my ancestors. The voices became more insistent, narrating unimaginable horrors. One night, as I read the diary of my great-great-grandmother, a woman who was committed to an asylum in the early 20th century, I heard her voice clearly, as if she were sitting beside me. "The blood carries the curse, Sarah. There is no escape." In my desperation, I turned to science. I spent sleepless nights in the laboratory, analyzing my own DNA, looking for some mutation, some anomaly that could explain what was happening. My colleagues began to notice my erratic behavior, my deep dark circles, the way I sometimes stopped mid-sentence, distracted by something only I could see or hear. It was during one of these frenzied research nights that I discovered something disturbing, a rare genetic variation, present in less than 0.01% population. A variation that, according to medical literature, was associated with extreme cases of schizophrenia and vivid hallucination. But there was something more, something that made my blood run cold. This variation seemed to have been amplified somehow. Desperate for answers, I pressed my Aunt Elena. I went to her house, confronted her with everything I had discovered. Between tears and sobs, nervously observing the shadows that now danced openly on the walls of her living room, she finally revealed a name: Thomas Reeves, my half-brother. "Your father? He had another child before you." "Sarah," Elena confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas started showing the same symptoms. When he turned 35, your father was devastated. He ran away. No one knows where to. I found Thomas in a psychiatric institution a few hours away. The process to see him was arduous. I had to use all my influence as a renowned researcher to gain access. When I finally entered his room, I felt as if I was looking into a distorted mirror of my future. Thomas was sitting in a corner, muttering to himself. His eyes, so similar to mine, were glazed over, lost in a world only he could see. When I approached, he looked up, and for a moment, I saw a flash of lucidity. "They're here now, aren't they?" Thomas murmured, his eyes scanning the room. "The dead. They never leave us in peace." I felt my blood run cold, because at that moment, I saw them too. Spectral figures crowding around us, faces contorted in expressions of pain and fury. I recognized some of them from the old portraits I had found. Long-dead ancestors, all with the same tormented look I now saw in Thomas, and in myself when I looked in the mirror. Thomas grabbed my arm, his fingers leaving marks on my skin. "You need to find him," he whispered urgently. "Our father. He's the key. He ran away, but the blood always finds a way back." I left the institution dazed, my mind a storm of questions and terror. The visions were now constant, following me even in daylight. Faces contorted in the clouds, voices screamed in the wind. I could barely distinguish what was real and what was hallucination. That's when I remembered something my mentor, Dr. Marcus, once mentioned about pioneering research in behavioral genetics that he conducted decades ago. Something about hereditary patterns of altered perception of reality. At the time, I didn't pay much attention, but now it seemed to be the only clue I had. I confronted Dr. Marcus in his office at the university. He had always been like a father to me, guiding me since my undergraduate days. When I entered his room, the shadows followed me, dancing on the shelves full of books. "Dr. Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to see the files from that old research of yours. The one about altered perception of reality." The expression on his face when I mentioned the subject told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. He paled, his eyes widening in shock and recognition. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I am your father." The world seemed to collapse around me. Dr. Marcus, my mentor, the man I had admired for years, was the source of the curse running through my veins. The shadows around us seemed to scream in triumph, their shapes contorting in a macabre dance of revelation. Between sobs, he told me everything. How he met my mother during his research on altered perception of reality. How they fell in love. How they were fascinated by the possibilities of expanding human consciousness. And then, how everything went terribly wrong. We thought we were opening doors to new levels of perception, Dr. Marcus said, tears running down his wrinkled face. But what we found on the other side wasn't of this world. He told me about the experiments, about how they used themselves as guinea pigs, altering their own genes in the pursuit of a forced evolution of the human mind, about how, at first, the visions seemed wonderful, glimpses of other worlds, of realities beyond our comprehension. But then things began to change. The visions became darker, more terrifying. Entities that shouldn't exist began to manifest, first only in the visions, then in reality. "Your mother was the first to realize the danger," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wanted to stop, destroy all the research. But I was obsessed. I wanted to go deeper, discover more." That's when the voices started for him, when the shadows began to follow him. Terrified by what he had unleashed, he ran away, abandoning my pregnant mother and his older son, Thomas. I hoped you had escaped," he said, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Somehow you were spared. I spent years studying, trying to find a cure, a way to reverse what we did. But the DNA, once altered in this way, there's no going back." As he spoke, I could see the shadows gathering around him, just as they did with me. I realized then that Dr. Marcus, my father, had spent decades fighting against the same visions, the same voices that now tormented me. "There's no cure, Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with regret and guilt. "But maybe there's a form of control, coexistence." He handed me a flash drive, his hands shaking. "Here's everything I've discovered over the years. Meditation techniques, experimental treatments, theories about the nature of what we're seeing and hearing. It's not a solution, but it might help." Then, with a heavy sigh, he added, "There's something else you need to know, Sarah. Something about your family lineage." My heart raced. "What do you mean?" "When I met your mother, I was fascinated not just by her, but by her family history. There were reports, rumors of family members who possessed unusual abilities, paranormal sensitivity, visions, premonitions. At the time, I believed it was just family folklore. But now He paused, his eyes lost in distant memories. Now I know it was real. Your family, Sarah, carried a rare genetic predisposition, a latent sensitivity to perceive beyond the veil of reality. Our experiments, they didn't create this ability. They amplified it. They awakened it from a millennial's sleep. Pieces started to fit together in my mind. The history of family tragedies that my Aunt Elena had shared, the old diaries, the accounts of madness and visions, all made terrible sense now. So, what we did, I began, my voice trembling. We took a spark and turned it into a wildfire, my father completed, his voice heavy with remorse. Your family's genetic predisposition was the key we were looking for, but we didn't understand the power we were unleashing. We didn't comprehend that some doors once opened cannot be closed. I left Dr. Marcus's office, my father's, feeling as if the weight of the universe was on my shoulders. The revelations, the implications of what I had discovered were almost too much to bear. In the days that followed, I immersed myself in the information on the flash drive. It was a bizarre mixture of cutting-edge science and what could only be described as modern mysticism. Theories about parallel dimensions, quantum consciousness, and the malleable nature of reality mingled with ancient meditation techniques and esoteric rituals. I began to experiment with some of the techniques: guided meditation, visualization exercises, even carefully formulated psychoactive substances. Gradually, I discovered that I could, if not control, at least influence the visions and voices. But each step I took towards control seemed to open new doors of perception. The entities I saw were no longer just shadows or reflections of dead ancestors. They were beings from other planes, creatures that defied human understanding. And they were aware of me, aware of all of us who carried this mutation. You opened the door, a voice whispered in my mind during a particularly intense meditation session. Now you must deal with the consequence. I realized then that what my parents had done was not just a genetic alteration or an expansion of consciousness. They had, inadvertently, amplified an ancestral connection between worlds. And we, I, Thomas, and who knows how many other descendants of this altered lineage, were the involuntary guardians of this bridge. As I deepened my studies, I began to better understand the dual nature of my inheritance. On one hand, there was the genetic predisposition of my maternal family, a latent sensitivity to the paranormal, cultivated over generations. On the other, my father's experiments had acted as a catalyst, awakening and amplifying this dormant potential. I scoured the family records with a new perspective. Stories that once seemed mere folklore now gained new light. The madness that afflicted my ancestors was not just a mental illness, but the result of unprepared minds being exposed to realities beyond our comprehension. In a particularly old diary, I found the account of a great-great-grandmother who spoke of guardians of the veil and sentinels between worlds. Were these titles a reference to the role our lineage unconsciously played? Over time, I learned to navigate between the visions. It wasn't easy. Each incursion into that other plane of existence was a battle against terror and madness. But gradually I began to discern patterns, to understand the silent language of that other world. Today, as I record this account, I don't know what the future holds for me or for those who, like me, carry this curse in their blood. The techniques I've learned allow me, at times, to navigate through the visions without completely losing myself. But each day I feel that the line between reality and whatever is beyond becomes thinner. Thomas remains in the institution, lost in a world only he can see. I visit him when I can, and there are moments when I see a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. But these moments are becoming rarer. Dr. Marcus, my father, continues his frantic research for a cure, a way to reverse what he did. But I see the growing despair in his eyes. The guilt consumes him each day. The shadows follow him too, always lurking, always whispering. As for me, I fight daily against the voices, against the vision. There are days when I almost convince myself that all of this is just an elaborate hallucination, a mental breakdown triggered by stress and bad genetics. But then, I see something out of the corner of my eye, hear a whisper that shouldn't exist, and I know the truth is much more terrible. I don't know if I'm a guardian, victim, or simply the result of an experiment that should never have happened. All I know is that terror runs in my veins, as real and alive as the blood keeps me alive. It is my inheritance, my curse. To those who may hear this recording in the future, consider this a warning. There is more to reality than our eyes can see or our minds comprehend. And some truths, once discovered, cannot be forgotten or ignored. The shadows are moving again. The voices are getting louder, more insistent. I need to go now. There's something calling me, something I need to see, need to understand, even if it means losing what's left of my sanity. May God have mercy on our souls. The veil between worlds is thin, and we are the unfortunate ones who can see through it.